Hi everyone, this is a Starry Woods Astro presentation, and I'll be your host, Tony of the Woods. This is the first of hopefully several presentations and video sharings I'll be doing on my Patreon and on my website. This first presentation I'll be sharing on Patreon, and I might make it live on YouTube or other areas for free later on. But this is just to get going, kind of a practice run, something I put together real quick that I thought would be interesting and maybe help some others who are studying different aspects of traditional astrology primarily, but with some modern twists as well. And so let's just get started. So the topic and title is Interplanetary Contact, Episode 1, Mercury-Mars. So this is the first in a series that I hope to do, exploring some of the different planetary combinations in the chart that one can look at. And so in this case, I chose Mercury and Mars for a few different reasons that I'll get into a little later. And so let's just jump right in. So this is just an outline, briefly describing what I'm going to go over. And so first I'm going to give an intro for the project of interplanetary contact, and then a little bit of what kind of how I'm looking at planetary combinations. And then we'll go into part one, which is a review of both traditional ancient and medieval astrologers and their view on the Mercury Mars combination, and then a few contemporary astrologers who've explored that duo. And then in part two, I'll start going into an example chart, kind of showing how one might do the craft or technique involved with analyzing a two-planet combination. We're just scratching the surface here, but it's a great way to get started. And then in part three, I'm going into a more mythological, image-based approach to see utilizing those two planets and bringing in other aspects like fixed stars and the decans and the tarot, what images and stories and themes start emerging that then become relevant to like the natives chart, even the timing considerations as well, and then a brief conclusion to wrap everything up. Okay, so an intro. So this is the first, like I said, in my interplanetary contact series, which I thought was a fun title. And so the main thing is looking at planetary pairs. And what I've come to notice more and more in my studies of astrology is they're very important. A lot of authors have talked about the pairs, and if you think about it, really any aspects are just two planets interacting in various ways, but they're still going to have a sort of set of significations for the combination of those two planets, just acted out through conjunction or sextile or square or trine or opposition or aversion in the case of lack of aspect. However, there being like a base kind of set of meanings that the different aspects involving those two planets kind of share and put forth. And so my main inspiration for looking at planetary pairs was Austin Kopic's talk from NORWAC 2021, I believe, workshop instead of a talk, where he kind of goes through various pairs of traditional planets and the south node and the north node, and kind of some of the meanings of those. As well as I was also inspired by Rob Hand's book Horoscope Symbols, where he talks about planetary pairs and how those meanings can be used in many different ways, such as midpoints and aspects, and lots as well. And then finally, another main inspiration was astrologer Sam Reynolds, who did a talk at one of the NORWACs involving looking at the Mercury-Moon combination and how it kind of delineates the psyche and the mind and the soul in different ways, and as a template for analyzing planetary pairs of different kinds. So I kind of took that and ran with it. And then again, I'll be looking at like the technical analysis or praxis, just a few ideas to get started of analyzing a planetary pair. And then kind of a mythological analysis is the second part, which I think is really important and interesting, especially when you're kind of approaching the the consultation space. And so, part one is a review. Again, the ancient medieval astrologers and then contemporary astrologers, with a fun image that I thought was one version of Mercury-Mars. We have a Mercury figure with the wings on the feet, but they're in like a leotard and fighting, doing some sort of martial art. And I thought that was just a fun kind of depiction. And so here's a little bit from the ancient and medieval astrologers on Mercury-Mars. First, I looked at Rhetorius, and these are translations from the Horoi Project, which you should absolutely subscribe um, on Patreon. And I just kind of pulled out a few tidbits from Rhetorius's planetary combination translation. Um, and I can share the exact name of any of these texts and links and whatnot if anyone's interested. Um, but one quote was liars, but smart ones, in anguish most of the time, but cunning, skilled in crafts, athletes, and pederasts. And so they're definitely a mixture of negative, one could say negative connotations, as well as some good ones here. We can see lying is coming out, and then in anguish uh, most of the time. So that's kind of a subjective experience that's not so hot, so to speak. And then some positive ones. Cunning is usually negatively associated, but it implies knowledge or an intellect that is serviceable. And then skilled in crafts and athletes. So I would want to note that traditionally, um, Mercury is not just intellect and mind, it has many significations, one of which is wrestling and another kind of contests. So when you combine that with Mars, the god of war, and like uh, physicality in a lot of ways, uh, it makes sense that like an athletic kind of body mindset would come in. And then the last one, pederasts, it's interesting. It's a term used for the traditional ancient Greek relationship between an older male and a younger male. And so maybe not as negative a word as pedophilia, but still not great in the modern context. I would tentatively associate it in the modern times with maybe more of a male male kind of same sex love. But that's something to be explored. Um, and moving on to Abu Mashar, famous medieval Islamic astrologer. And I'm picking out a few tidbits from a translation of Ben Dykes from On the Revolutions of the Years of Nativities. And these are specifically from timing passages, so about perfections and distributions. But I do think that the delineations do point to more general conceptions of Mercury Mars, so I wouldn't take them as necessarily, oh, this is how it is for natal, but more so as inspiration for exploring the combination of those two like planetary signatures. And so these aren't exact quotes, but kind of things I pulled out here and there. Cleverness, diligent in works, quick to move in things, praised, lucky, increase in logic, culture, and knowledge, harm to siblings, concocting lies and falsehoods, quarrelsome thoughts and speech. So we can see again some good connotations and meanings connected to knowledge and the mind, quickness. Um, Here, there's also some additional parts of being praised and lucky. Um, so those are most likely when Mercury and Mars are well dignified and in the chart and maybe connected to benefics versus harm to siblings and lies and um, like quarreling might be more of the negative associations, connections with malefics or debilitated placements. Although I suppose any of these significations could come up. And then moving on to Al Biruni, and this is from his kind of collection of friendships and enmities between the planets. I'm getting this from Joy Usher's great book, A Tiny Universe, which kind of uses the Thema Mundi chart as a jumping off point for kind of delving into different topics in traditional astrology. I feel like that's a book that gets slept on quite a bit. So definitely take a look at that. And what after looking through that, Mercury and Mars are neither mutually hurtful nor injurious, nor offering friendship nor asking friendship from. So, at least according to Alberuni, Mercury and Mars are kind of lukewarm to each other. Um, I I would say that that could use some more research for sure. I'm just kind of getting a few starting points, um, but definitely looking at whether Mercury is diurnal or nocturnal probably makes a difference, and in the specific chart, whether uh, Mercury is under the beams of the sun and how Mercury and Mars receive each other. But we'll look at that a little bit in a minute. And then moving on to some contemporary astrologers. Again, mentioning the 36 Dramas talk by Austin Coppock from, I believe, NORWAC 2021. I won't go into it in too much detail. You should check it out. Highly recommend it. But the name that he gives, the Mercury Mars combination, is the Blade Juggler. So you can kind of see that's an interesting combination of like the blades, symbolism of Mars, of cutting and sharpness, and then the juggling, like performance and acrobatic associations with Mercury, versus the more obvious, maybe sharp tongue type connotations. So just kind of have that image in your mind as well. Moving on, horoscope symbols, a book by Rob Hand. He kind of gives brief delineations of each planetary pair. In his case, with all of the planets out to Pluto, as well as the nodes, and I believe connections to the ascendant, MC, and the nodes. So highly recommend that book. It was from an earlier point in Rob Hand's career, but I think a lot of the material really stands up. He's a great author. And what he says about Mercury and Mars is the expression of anger or conflict, fondness for argument or debate, energetic and vigorous thinking, verbal self-assertion, the determination to act upon one's own ideas, and forceful intellect. So we can see these are pretty straightforward combinations of the meanings of Mercury and Mars. So we have the expression Mercury of anger or conflict, Mars, fondness for argument or debate. That's like argumentative words, so Mars and Mercury. Energetic and vigorous, Mars, thinking, Mercury. And then verbal, Mercury, self assertion, Mars. And so uh, relatively straightforward, but still nice to kind of think about. And then my last section here is from Pathways to Wholeness, which is a book by Ren Butler, who is an astrologer, archetypal astrologer from the uh, Tarnas tradition. And what Ren says about Mercury or Mars, it says it engages, stimulates, and provokes thought processes, rash and heated speech, outbursts, sarcasm, objectivity and perspective brought to anger issues, sharp, discordant, and hectic logistical arrangements. And so that's a nice selection. Um, Particularly the perspective brought to anger issues was a nice one that I liked. And then hectic logistical arrangements is more of a physical embodiment of Mercury Mars, which is a nice thing to think about. So if you're thinking of Mercury things like travel, and then having that be hectic or irritable or difficult in some ways, kind of bringing that Mars energy to the Mercury experience. Uh, yeah, so we'll move on from there. And then I have one more section on the modern authors or modern contemporary astrologers. And this is also an example of something I'd like to do more, which is we have a ton of great resources online on YouTube that people are sharing, and podcasts as well, and writing. And what people have to do to really learn well from it is sift from it and pull out the gems and study them. So in this case, I was looking at the Nightlight Astrology podcast by Adam Ellenboss, which I highly recommend. He goes through different real-time transits. I believe he has daily videos, and there's just those are just packed with knowledge. So I was like, okay, I want to learn about Mercury and Mars. So I picked out a few videos where in the past there were Mercury Mars aspects, and in them Adam goes through some of the archetypal uh, qualities that pop up when you combine Mercury and Mars. And here I've just quoted a few. videos, and I believe the date on the second one is wrong. But it was about a year prior um, for the Mercury square Mars video. But anyways, from these two videos, I pulled out a few, and this is just part of what he did. Definitely recommend trying this with your favorite podcasts or YouTubers. Is really listen to what they're saying closely and pull out keywords or aphorisms that you can study later. In the case of Mercury-Mars, we have intelligence, wit, decisive action, tech crime. So we have Mercury as like a symbolizing technology, and then Mars symbolizing security or crime. We have accidents while doing mercurial actions, kind of harking back to the difficulty with travel associated from the previous slide. And then we have sharp tongue, wit, verbal abuse, analytical, cut and dissect, skill or craft in martial trade, games, athletic skill or ability, deals, aggressive offer or trade, persuasive speech with goal or desire to get something done, strategy, the art of war as a book, particularly Mercury Mars associated, independently minded, thought policing, and then something I threw in there when I was listening to Adam's video was marketing as a kind of a Mercury Mars, marketing in its more aggressive stance. So, like I said, this is just a very nice example of going through a material of an astrologer that you respect and like how they do things, and rather than just listening to what's going on with the transit, pulling out learnings that you can take with you like further into your study. So there's that. And then so I'll be moving into the next part, which is looking at a bit of craft or examples. In this case, I came up with this kind of quickly as a result of looking at my own chart. So in this case, I'll use my own chart to show kind of why I pulled out Mercury Mars and how to look through some various Mercury Mars techniques that one can do, or techniques for analyzing pairs of planets. In the future, I'll look at other types of charts as well. Um, so I'll get into it. So why I chose Mercury Mars and why this kind of popped up for me as an interesting topic, besides being obsessed with planetary pairs for a while, was me thinking of the Mercury ingress into Aquarius that happened, I believe, over the weekend, so a few days ago as of this filming, and what that might mean for my chart. And so I noticed that the Mercury ingress will begin to square my natal Mars in Scorpio. So we have the Mercury ingress on the outer wheel here, showing the transit into Aquarius, and then Mars here in Scorpio. That's my natal placement. And at the same time, not at the same time, but within the same sign, Mercury will also trine transiting Mars. And so that's kind of a double activation of those themes while Mercury is going through Aquarius. And then also, um, there's some other things going on that I'll point out in a slide or two. So, kind of getting to the analysis of the two planets, kind of pulling in some technique and just briefly touching upon a few, and any of these could be expanded, by the way. You want to look at natal first. So you want to do a natal analysis and then look at timing in general with astrological studies. But basically, just briefly, you can see this is my natal chart, and you can see my Mars and Mercury have. Let me move this video here. I'll just turn off that part. Yeah, sorry. You can see that Mars and Mercury have a co-presence in Scorpio, and Mercury is separating from Mars. So it's not the strongest pair of planets, but it's definitely activated in my chart. And so you also see that Mercury is received by Mars in his domicile, um, and Mercury is also, Mars is a malefic, but it's a night chart, so it's not going to be as bad of malefic in general. And Mercury is separating from Mars, so it's going to take a bit of the edge off from that being involved with a malefic. And so overall, Mercury could be worse. And you can also look at the natal synodic cycle phase. So that's kind of like putting moon phases towards any two planet combination. Um, and if you look, Mercury just recently separated. So if Mars were the sun, and then Mercury were the moon in the analogy to lunar phases, this would be like a new moon phase. Uh, so we could look at it's basically a new moon of Mercury-Mars topics, and those are both like general Mercury-Mars topics, like we looked at in the part one of this presentation, uh, like arguments, context, intellectual energy, and passion, but also the specific uh, Mercury Mars significations in the natal chart. So, for example, Mars as the ruler of the 5th and the 10th, Mercury as the ruler of the 3rd and the 12th, um, bringing all those together. I won't be going through all of those and analyzing what that new moon of those topics looks like, but it's definitely something I'd like to delve into more. Because the lunar cycle phase, synodic cycle phase kind of way of looking at things is really interesting and has a lot of depth to it. And another thing that we can look at with a two planet combination are the almutants of the planets. And so this is borrowed from Sam Reynolds' presentation of the Moon Mars analysis. Um, and almutants is a medieval technique where you look at all the different levels of dignity, and each planet will have a ruler overall when you combine all the levels of dignity. And that's usually done with a point system, which I did here. And I used a point system from Charlie Obert, his book, Intro to Traditional Native Astrology. I'm sorry, Intro to Traditional Natal Astrology. And he gives a slightly different list of values. I believe he gives the bound 3 points instead of two, and he gives the triplicities rulers, all three of them, 2 points each. So if we look at Mars really briefly, Mars is the ruler of Scorpio, so gets 5 points. Uh, is in his own bound, so he'll get 3 points for that. He's in his own decan, which he gets 1 point for that. And then there's no exaltation ruler. Um, and then there's the three triplicity rulers of the water sign at night, uh, and that is Mars, Venus, and the Moon in that order. But in this case, for the points, we just give 2 points for each Mars, Venus, and Moon. So clearly, the almutant of Mars is Mars. It's one of the most dignified positions uh, that Mars can even have in the chart. And that's a really brief example. If anyone would like any links to like exploring almutants and the pointing system and where I got the various points from, let me know and I can share about that. And I'll probably do more about that in a future video. And then, so do that. I basically did that for Mercury and Mars separately. In this case, both almutants are Mars. And then the combined almutant for both of those is where you just combine all of the points for those two planets together. And then you have this combined super ruler of both planets. In this case, again, Mars. And so uh, that will have something to say about Mars will really be the leader of this Mercury Mars combination. So it will lean Martian. It will be done in Martian ways. This can be analyzed in detail, but I just kind of wanted to give a few things you can look at. And then I just wanted to throw in looking at just the bounds, because traditionally they're such a powerful technique, and I'm just starting to delve into that myself. But just briefly looking, Mercury is in his own bounds, or their own bounds, and Mars is in his own bounds. So bound. So they're both operating and enacting what needs to be done in a way that is congruent with their nature. So the bound placement tells about the kind of physical, practical enactment. It's kind of like the manager versus like the store owner. For example, the manager is going to do more of the heavy lifting and the specific minutia that needs to get done. And so both Mars and Mercury are happy with how they're doing things, essentially. That's just a brief look at a few of the ways you can kind of analyze two planets. And then we can look at some timing activations of why this combination is very strong for me personally at this point. In my Ferdaria longer cycles, I'm in a Mars Sun Ferdaria in night chart. And so that's going to activate Mars and the Sun, in this case, both of which are in Scorpio with Mercury. Um, so definitely the Mars Mercury is activated in that way. And then in the decennials, which are roughly 10-year periods where each of the planets takes over rulership, but specifically these pairs of planets are activated. It's a unique planetary system that comes from Valens, I believe, was the first mention. And I got Austin Kopic has another talk on decennials, which is really nice to look into. So definitely search for that one. And my current decennial, the main period is Mercury, and the sub period is also Mercury. And so we're seeing again Mercury in Scorpio highlighted, uh, and Mars from the Ferdaria. And then if we look at perfections, I'm currently in a perfected Aries year, which is my natal 10th house, and that's the perfections from the ascendant. And then there's three other traditional perfections that are great to look at every year: perfections from the MC, perfections from the sect light, and perfections from the lot of fortune. In this case, the MC and the sect light are in the same sign. We see my sect light is the moon, and the MC is right next to the moon. And so those are both perfected to Capricorn, and that's a little less of an activation. But Capricorn is the exaltation of Mars, and we got a Mars sextile from Scorpio to Capricorn, and then a lot of fortune to Sagittarius. Just threw that in there to notate that fourth. And then looking at the solar return currently, which is the outer wheel, or the planets along the outer edge here um, in this chart, we can see that Mars is in Gemini and Mercury is in Scorpio. So they actually have a non aspected mutual reception. And so, from what I've been able to gather about mutual receptions, they're still active when there's no aspect. It's just a little more indirect. It's still a beneficial thing to have. Mutual receptions typically will undo some of the difficulty of a placement. And so, pretty happy to see that. And uh, had lichen girdled here, but that's not actually correct. So just disregard that one. And then we look at I'm looking at the solar return cycle phase between Mercury and Mars. Ooh, sorry, going crazy. Okay, and that would be equivalent to the waxing gibbous phase. So that's where the moon is almost full. It's kind of working to reach fullness. And something interesting to note that I could note if I'm doing this analysis for myself is my natal lunar phase is waxing gibbous. So that's just like a ping to add to the list of things to consider when kind of balancing all of the information towards the end. And just briefly looking at the solar return ascendant and ascendant lord, which are always important to look at with solar return. Solar return ascendant is Cancer, and we have the moon, the ruler of Cancer, in Gemini with Mars. And so that's another kind of activation of Mercury and Mars, Mercury being the ruler of Gemini, and the moon being with Mars in the same sign. And also we can look at the solar return Almutans and combined Almutans. In this case, Mercury's Almutan is Mars, and Mars Almutan is Mercury, and the combined Almutan is Mercury. And so definitely a lot of Mars Mercury stuff going on. And so it's like, okay, time to make a Mars Mercury video. All right. And so we've kind of collected a lot of data in that part two. Now in part three, still more data coming, but it's more um, gathering mythology and images. And so I have a few different ways that I'm approaching that. One is looking at fixed stars connections, and another is looking at Deccan images and the tarot. And so we'll move on here. So if I would, for fixed stars, what I'm doing is I'm looking at both ecliptic conjunctions or fixed stars projected onto the ecliptic. In this case, none have really popped out for my Mars and Mercury. There are fixed stars everywhere, and they're projected onto the ecliptic. Um, but of the roughly like 50 to 75 major fixed stars that, for example, Bernadette Brady looks at in her books, none of those are super near to my natal Mercury or Mars. So I moved on to fixed star parents, again from the work of Bernadette Brady, and a lot of great work from some other astrologers as well, like Sasha Ravich. When looking at my Mercury, it has a parin with Menkar, which is a star in Cetus, the sea monster. It's called the whale, but really it's more of a sea monster of the depths. Uh, and another is a pairing with Alphard, and that's in the constellation Draco. And so both of these are kind of intense, deep, chthonic, and even like watery or uh, reptilian associations. So a bit scary, one could say. Um, but there is kind of like a indication of like dredging up things from the depths or accessing the collective unconscious. And Sasha Ravich has talked about Menkar as being like a sort of primordial female figure, like Tiamat from Sumerian mythology. And so when I think of that, I actually thought of the D&D creature known as the Aboleth, which is this top image here, kind of this ancient, wise creature of the depths that's scary, but might have something to teach if one can approach it in the proper way. And then looking at Mars, have a parin, two parents actually, with a fixed star Hamal, which is in the constellation of Aries, the Ram, and I believe it's the head of the ram. And then there's a parin with the star of Capella, which is in the constellation of Auriga, the charioteer. Um, Interestingly, both have associations with like goats or rams. So Capella, one of the images is like of a she goat with two kids, and Hamal, of course, the ram, and bringing in the story of like Jason and the Golden Fleece, stealing the fleece of a particular special kind of ram. And so for this, they're both stars of like independence and freedom and direct action. Really kind of naturally go with Mars, in my opinion. Capella is interesting because it also has a feminine energy versus the more masculine feel that Hamal gives. Capella is also associated with like the moon goddess Artemis, and so the image I chose was of a black goat because I actually thought of the Lovecraft uh, elder god of the black goat of the woods as a being that would kind of encapsulate some of this Mars, Hamal, Capella energy. And so those are those. And I also looked at the Decans and Tarot images, and I kind of put those together because the Decans are connected with the Tarot minors. So just looking at the Tarot for the Mars and Mercury cards, in this I'm using specifically this deck called Tabula Mundi by M. Maylene. It's a really great deck. Really recommend it. Love the imagery and colors and drawing style. Um, but the card for Mars is the Tower here on the upper left, and the card for Mercury is the Magician up on the upper right, which is at his turntable at the DJ Mercury. And we're looking at the Decans after that. And so, just a brief note on the Decans, and I can put a link to this, but there's a writer who talked about the Decans as an injection. I'm calling it an injection of the liminal into this precise astrological system. So these are mysterious images that bring in like some sort of magic or enchantment that just looking at astrology in a very mechanical way can't like approach just by itself. And the decans really bring in these strange images and associations, but can really expand one's interpretation, kind of getting into more of an oracular mode. Um, and so for each of the decans, I'm going to look at a few different things. Let's go through the Scorpio 1, which is the first decan of Scorpio. And it's where my natal Mars is. And so, one, I would look at Austin Coppock, another great book by Austin is 36 Faces, which I don't have, but I have found the names that he has titled all the decans in his book. Um, and the Scorpio 1 he calls the jawbone. And then also look at T. Susan Chang's title that she gives each decan, and she's a astrologer and tarot practitioner who has really explored the decanic minors of the tarot, and so those are the numbered cards associated with each of the 36 decans, and she calls it the Storm of Tears. And the card itself associated with Scorpio 1 is the Five of Cups, as you can see on the bottom left here. And then you can see it has a image of Scorpio, the symbol of Scorpio, and the symbol of Mars, to show that Mars is the decanic ruler of the first decan of Scorpio. And the title is called Disappointment. These titles come from the Crowley tradition of tarot, but we don't have to go into that much further. And then I would also look at the Picatrix image, or any other decanic image. I just had the Picatrix at hand, the John Michael Greer and Christopher Warnock edition. The image for Scorpio 1 that I pulled out is: there rises in the first face of Scorpio a man with a lance in his right hand, and in his left hand he holds the head of a man. This is a face of settlement, sadness, ill will, and hatred. This is its form. And I love that phrase, "this is its form." It reminds me of The Mandalorian. Uh, this is the way. But anyways, now we can move on to looking at the Scorpio 2, which is my decan placement of my natal Mercury. And the title of that from Austin Coppock is The Double Distiller. And T. Susan Chang calls it the Golden Hour. And the tarot card is the Six of Cups. And the Picatrix image is: there rises in the second face of Scorpio a man riding a camel, holding a scorpion in his hand. This is a face of knowledge, modesty, settlement, and of speaking evil of one another. This is its form. And so that's interesting. They both use the word settlement, and I'm not sure if that's a technical term, something to look into, or if it just literally means settling down. That would be surprising, but then again, Scorpio is a fixed sign, so that might be involved somehow. And so I'll move on to the next slide here. And so this is just a little summary of what I would do kind of moving forward and getting even more personal and deep into this exploration is kind of start combining and correlating everything we've collected thus far, and kind of just to see what are the recurring like motifs and stories and tales, myths and images, and what new stories or myths start popping up based on what you're looking into, because that can really get to interesting places, I find, with analyzing charts. And I added a line of modern myths and tales, dream imagery, inner world imagery, omens in the outer world. So those other four bullet points are really just talking about getting creative and more relational with how you're approaching um, delineating and looking at uh, different astrological signatures, because the technique is great. But when you let the various things that pop up when looking at technique interact and talk and grow and pull in things that you've noticed in your daily life, inner world imagery, like from your creativity or daydreaming or um, desires or things you've been fixated on, things that pop up in dreams, if I mentioned that already. And then modern myths and tales, like what TV shows or movies or modern books seem to be connected in some way, or embody these two planet combinations in interesting ways. So kind of letting everything ferment and seeing what comes out. And in the context of a reading, also inviting uh, the client or a person you're reading for uh, to share these as well, because you're kind of building these stories together uh, and eliciting it from their chart and from their experience and from your experience as an astrologer and just a human interacting with them. Uh, and so, yeah, there's some conclusions here. Basically, analyze significant pairs. I picked out Mercury-Mars as a starting point, but looking at a chart, I would pick out the 2 to 5 most closest, most significant pairs of planets, closest aspects. I mean, maybe mutual receptions or very angular planets. Um, any planets that pop out and the pairs they're involved in, and then see um, when they're activated at various times through various timing techniques, and then using those analyses to investigate the stories, myths, and images of your personal or your client's personal interplanetary dynamic. And I made a little acronym here, JERP, which I thought was fun. Journal, enact, reflect, and pray. So journal as a way of kind of exploring these different connections, especially for like your own natal chart explorations. Um, you can I find that things pop up that wouldn't have otherwise popped up of just kind of doing the technique only. Enact, recognizing some of the more positive planetary pairs and maybe enacting the more positive enacting the more positive significations of a planetary planetary pair, um, versus letting like the negative ones erupt through you. For example, for Mercury or Mars, like deceit or lying, versus like athleticism. Maybe this will be a form of remediation in a way. Maybe uh, do athletic enactments or exercises or play, and that may reduce one's tendency to having outbursts or tendencies towards lying, for example. And then pray, just a general exhortation to get involved in like daily planetary practice, which there's a ton available online to look at. And here's just a list of a few of my references. Again, I can share more book titles and links as well. I just wanted to kind of put a few names out there. I won't go through them all. I've mentioned several already, but a lot of great minds out there in the astrology world. So thank you for listening to this talk. Again, this is my first one, kind of a practice run. I'll release it on Patreon first, and then maybe I'll release this one publicly, or maybe do a more detailed version at some point with a different chart, looking at Mercury and Mars and some of the things I found in the meantime. But yeah, check me out. I'm on Twitter at Tony of the Woods. And my website is starrywoodsaastro.com, and the Patreon is patreon.com/Tony of the Woods. Thank you.